welcome back to Doodling Through Education. Before we get started, I wanted to go ahead and remind you, if you haven't already, to go ahead and subscribe to this channel so you never miss an episode from Doodling Through Education. So, now that that's taken care of, let's get going. So, for this week, we are going to be talking about George Washington. And for my CC students, it is our foundations memory work and it's our history work, week 5. So we are going to be talking about George Washington. We'll talk about his early life and his life leading up to when he became the first president. And then we'll talk a little bit about afterwards and the end of his life. So let's go ahead and start doodling. George Washington was born February 22nd, 1732 on his family's plantation in the British colony of Virginia. Much is unknown about his early education, but typically children from well-off families like his were taught in his home by private tutors. His father sadly passed away when George Washington was only 11 years old, and it is believed he then began helping his mother around the plantation because he was her oldest son. Later on, as a teenager, he succeeded in surveying. His surveying trips brought him into the wilderness and actually helped him earn enough money to start buying land. Now, George Washington had an older half-brother from his father's previous marriage that served as his mentor for many years. His name was Lawrence Washington. Lawrence Washington contracted tuberculosis and unfortunately died at the young age of just 34. It was at this point that George Washington inherited Lawrence's estate, Mount Vernon. In January 1759, he married a woman named Martha Custis, who was a wealthy widow with 2 children. Washington became a devoted stepfather to her children, and him and Martha Washington actually never had any children of their own. In his personal life, Washington expanded Mount Vernon from just 2,000 acres into an 8,000-acre property with 5 farms. He grew a variety of crops, including wheat and corn. He also bred mules and maintained fruit orchards and even a successful fishery. He was deeply interested in farming and continually experimented with new crops and methods of land conservation. Washington's military experience began in December of 1752 when he was made commander of the Virginia militia. He was also involved in the French and Indian War, but resigned his position in 1759 and returned home to Mount Vernon. It was during this time that he was elected to the Virginia House of Burgesses, which was an English representative government that passed laws and maintained order. By the late 1760s, Washington had experienced firsthand the effects of rising taxes that were imposed on the American colonists by the British, and he came to believe that it was in the best interests of the colonists to declare independence from England. Washington was at the First Continental Congress, which we briefly talked about, which happened in 1774 in Philadelphia. He served as a delegate there. By the time the Second Continental Congress convened a year later, the American Revolution had begun, and Washington was named Commander-in-Chief of the Continental Army. In 1783, with the signing of the Treaty of Paris between Great Britain and the U.S., Washington believed he was done with his duty. He gave up his command of the army, and he returned to his passion at Mount Vernon. He wanted to resume his life as a farmer and a family man. However, in 1787, he was asked to attend the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia and head the committee to draft the new Constitution. All of the delegates there were deeply impressed by his leadership and believed he was by far the most qualified man to become the nation's first president. Washington was not so sure of this at first. He wanted to return to his quiet life and leave the governing of the new nation to others. But the public opinion of his peers and the delegates were so strong that eventually he accepted. The first presidential election was held on January 7th, 1789, and Washington easily won this. So remember, this was before Washington, D.C. became America's capital city. So George Washington lived in New York and Philadelphia. While he was president, he signed a bill which established the U.S. Capitol along the Potomac River, and later it was named Washington, D.C. in his honor. George Washington's presidency was marked by a series of firsts. He signed the first United States copyright law, which protected the copyrights of authors. He also signed the first Thanksgiving proclamation, making November 26th a national day of Thanksgiving for the end of the war for American independence and the successful ratification of the Constitution. Now, we celebrate Thanksgiving on the fourth Thursday of November. In 1796, after 2 terms as president, George Washington finally decided to retire. He declined to serve a 3rd term. Washington has a famous farewell address that he spoke to the nation to announce his resignation, and he urged them to keep the highest standards domestically and to keep involvement with the foreign powers outside our country to a minimum. This address is still read each February in the U.S. Senate to commemorate Washington's birthday. George Washington was then able to finally retire to his home at Mount Vernon like he desired. But in December of 1799, he caught a cold after inspecting his property in the rain. Unfortunately, this cold quickly developed into an infection in his throat, and he died on the night of December 14th, 1799, at the age of only 67. He was buried at Mount Vernon, which in 1960 was designated a National Historic Landmark. And truly, Washington left one of the most enduring legacies of any American in history. He is known as the father of his country, and his face appears on the U.S. dollar bill and quarter, and dozens of U.S. schools, towns, and counties, as well as the state of Washington and the nation's capital city, are all named for him. And that is all we have for today. As I always encourage you to do so, go home and talk to your parents, your siblings about George Washington. Try and find a quarter or a dollar bill that your parents might have, and look how George Washington's face is on those pieces of currency. And talk about all the different ways in which George Washington may have impacted our country. So on that note, remember to be kind follow God's will, and take care. Bye.